Welcome to Module 1, Preparing for Systems Change, brought to you by the Systems Planning Collective. This module is part of the Systems Planning Collective's curriculum. The full curriculum will be hosted on the Homelessness Learning Hub. Throughout this module, we encourage you to write down any questions you may have and then head over to the discussion forum on the Homelessness Learning Hub to start a conversation. Systems Planning Collective members will review these questions and get back to you. I'm your host, Lindsay McCrae, and I'm a Communications Officer at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Now, I'll introduce you to your instructors. Mary Jane McKitterick, Community Planning Manager at Away Home Canada, and Amanda Bucknia, Policy and Planning Coordinator at Away Home Canada.
I will take us through our agenda today, and after that, my colleague Amanda will provide an overview of the Systems Planning Collective and what we do and how we work. I will introduce Module 1 and our learning goals, and Amanda will then introduce what it is we need to change in order to do systems planning work. The next section, Section 2, is where we dig into the foundational concepts or building blocks of change management and homelessness. In the final section of the webinar, we will begin to apply foundational concepts to change management theory.
Yes, next slide. Okay, so who is the Systems Planning Collective for those of you who may be unfamiliar? The Systems Planning Collective, or SPC, is a joint effort between Away Home Canada, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and Turner Strategies. We've come together to leverage our collective expertise and experience working with communities on homelessness and housing planning, policy, and practice. And you can see the list of SPC members here. Our goal is to support communities and governments to prevent and end all forms of homelessness. This is in response to the growing demand that we've had from communities to leverage all of the systems that can contribute either directly or indirectly to homelessness and its solutions. The SPC will be providing tools and resources such as these modules and building systems planning capacity within communities through training and technical assistance. The modules are just one way that we hope to support systems planning leaders to ground themselves in foundational concepts and content, as well as learning new skills and implementing tools that can take their planning work further, faster. We're coordinating our efforts to have a broader impact and deeper impact than any of our organizations could do on their own. We want to take a comprehensive and strengths-based approach to building on what's working well within your community and identifying opportunities for change and growth with supports that are tailored to your needs rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach. Modules such as this one on preparing for systems change are just one component of a much broader plan for knowledge mobilization, change management, training, and skills development that can put communities on the path to setting and achieving ambitious goals and systems transformation, particularly in the context of the government's new homelessness strategy, Reaching Home. And now I'll turn it over to Mary Jane.
When we began this work, we engaged communities to find out what they needed in order to begin to do systems planning. We asked community entities across Canada to complete a needs assessment survey, and we learned that communities needed more support with priorities like relationship and trust building and change management, alongside the more focused priority areas like government relations and financial scenario modeling, as areas in which they required support. Many communities are struggling to shift their culture from responsive, crisis-oriented helpers of the vulnerable to a planned, strategic, and upstream approach that puts the user at the center, redistributes power, and creates a holistic, caring, and healthy environment for people experiencing homelessness, but also the front-facing organizations, communities, and relevant public systems. Fortunately, there is a growing body of work we can use to help us make that shift. In Module 1, we're going to talk a bit about the foundations in systems change concepts that set the stage for future modules. And we have an accompanying guide that is designed to support this module. It's more in-depth and has more tools and resources than this webinar, and we encourage you to seek it out. System change means shifting the conditions that hold homelessness in place. We're very much indebted to the folks at FSG in the United States for their article on the water of systems change that started a conversation among foundations, actually, about their role in systems change to address the deeply rooted social issues. More than anything, I think Module 1 is about starting to have those conversations and name those conditions and factors we do not always see because we are in it. A fish is swimming along one day when another fish comes up and says, "Hey, how's the water?" The first fish stares back blankly at the second fish and then says, "What's water?" The deeper work of systems change then is to find better ways to see the water or the conditions that work to keep homelessness in place. There is, again, a growing body of work we can draw on to deepen our understanding of how to create meaningful change through collaboration. And we can apply that to our systems planning efforts. The foundational concepts introduced in this module will be developed further in future SPC modules. So this will be a theme continuing on, and we'll provide supports for that. In this first module, we'll identify some of the moments or fault lines where changing how we work and where we can get stuck. Often we're not really aware of what is holding us back. We just know that our efforts are slowing down or even stopped. By understanding where some of these fault lines lie, we can bring attention to our work, address them as they arise, but I think maybe more importantly, avoid the frustration and pessimism that can creep into our work as we work to sustain momentum. In Module 1, we'll begin to identify how some of these changes that impact other parts of our systems that may first seem unrelated. And it'll lay the groundwork for future modules, as mentioned.
So in order to begin doing systems planning work, it's important to think through some of those fundamental changes and shifts in our thinking and approaches that are essential to this work. So taking a systems approach, it inherently means change. And broadly, we can see this change in three main categories. The first is from the emergency response to prevention and sustaining exits from homelessness. The second is this shift from a focus on singular system approach to an integrated systems approach. And finally, there's the shift from an eligibility-based approach to a rights-based approach. And I'll address each of these in a bit more detail. So the first area of change is this shift away from a crisis-focused model of intervention. And often our resources are dedicated to homelessness, focusing on emergency responses and crisis intervention instead of addressing the upstream systemic structural reasons that people become homeless in the first place. Similarly, there's not often enough attention focused on and investment focused in the activities that help those that have exited homelessness to stabilize and maintain their housing with appropriate supports over the long term. Systems planning and systems thinking require us to think bigger picture and to strategically look at the ways that systems and structures can either cause and or be a part of the solutions to homelessness. For more information on what this kind of shift entails, you can go to the Homeless Hub and download New Direction, a framework for homelessness prevention, as well as the roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness. Typically, communities have focused their attention on coordinating and aligning the players that are directly involved in housing and homelessness services. And while it's essential to have those players working together, systems planning involves moving away from just thinking about the singular homeless system to the many systems that interact and intersect with the homeless serving system in both formal and informal ways. For example, you have systems such as corrections that may contribute to homelessness in your community because of improper discharge planning or the lack of connection with community for those sentences have ended. And while it may not be correctional institutions' formal mandate to prevent homelessness, we can think about the issue from their perspective and from the perspective of reducing recidivism. If we don't want people cycling back into corrections, it's important that they have a community of supports and stable place to live in place when it comes to time to exit. And it's a little bit of a different perspective on the issue if we're thinking about preventing and ending homelessness, but ultimately it ends up achieving the same goals. This is an example of taking a systems approach. You may know that there's an issue with a particular system, but you need to find a way to make that issue salient and resonate with that system using their language in a way that leads them to take action and responsibility and bring them into an integrated system of care. Dr. Alina Turner and Diana Cressy also have an excellent article called Bringing It All Together, Integrating Services to Address Homelessness, which delves into this a bit more. The goal of systems integration is really to connect the dots between and find ways to align and leverage resources, policies, plans, and practices across systems in order to strengthen your community's response to homelessness and improve outcomes. This also helps you identify where the gaps might be and how you can collectively fill them. In some cases, this might mean sharing data, and in other cases, it's a matter of improving communication flows between organizations and systems. Finally, there's a need to move away from thinking simply about program and service eligibility and really taking a person-centered and person-driven approach to service and supports. This is really at the heart of a rights-based community approach to care, as it recognizes that while not everyone will need the same level or degree of support, for example, not everybody needs supportive housing or to be in an intensive housing first program. There are needs that can be met and strengths that can be built upon with supports of other systems and sectors so that every individual and family receives what they need when they need it to either prevent homelessness or to keep them from returning to homelessness. So to wrap up this section, here are some reflexive questions that you can start to begin thinking about either personally or to discuss with your teams or your community. The first question is, are you on board with the shift away from a heavy emphasis on emergency responses to homelessness and toward prevention and sustaining exits from homelessness? The second is, how do you feel about the shift from work being the sole responsibility of homeless serving sector toward being a shared public, both government and institutional, private and nonprofit responsibility, so a collective responsibility? And third, how do you feel about the shift from a charity and eligibility approach toward a rights-based, person-centered approach?
Great. So now we'll begin to do some thinking about some concepts that should be embedded in our systems planning process. That would be complexity, trust, and approaches that can support how we do this work. The opposite of tragedy is complexity, creativity, nuance, depth, and layers. Ojibwe author David Troyer provides us with a different way to think about complexity and not be overwhelmed by it. It's critical right now when we feel we are being overwhelmed by so much that's happening in the world. Historically, our reductive focus on homelessness has been tragedy, framing it as only a tragedy and its related conditions. And the reaction has been to use emergency and crisis response naturally. But this has also contributed to its growth as an intractable social problem. And homelessness is a complex systems issue. So the counter narrative to intractable homelessness then is to engage fully with its complexity. So what we want to do now with systems planning is to frame complexity as something not to be feared or overwhelmed by, but managed and embraced, that'll help us to work upstream. So a word or two about trust. Trust is the ability to build or hold or even regain trust in this process is central to our ability to successfully transform our response to homelessness. Trust is the glue that holds complex social processes together throughout profound social change. But like glue, it is often invisible. As we engage with multiple systems, all with their own unique processes, values, relationships, we do this against, again, the backdrop of society that is experiencing profound social, political, environmental, and technological change. Even those who are typically most comfortable with change and adaptation can really struggle with this much uncertainty, let alone those who are of more of a fixed mindset. We really need to work to build trust with those around us, across sectors, and perhaps most importantly, within ourselves. As we build out this curriculum, we will move forward with systems planning. We will develop to support that trust building exercise throughout. So the next fundamental is change management. Change management comes from the field of behavioral economics. It is a discipline that guides how we prepare, equip, and support individuals to adopt change to drive organizational success. But we can take and adapt change management theory and practice from that field and apply it across multiple systems and sectors for transformative change in homelessness itself. And finally, we'll talk a bit about collective impact. And I'm sure many of those folks working out in homelessness have been using collective impact. Collective impact is really well aligned with systems planning work. It offers a practical set of processes, structures to foster collaboration. It is a cross-sector framework that allows systems thinking to unfold, take hold, and endure. It involves the commitment of a group of actors from different sectors to a common agenda for solving a specific social problem using a structured form of collaboration. And the principles, I'll just step through those lightly at this point because I think they're quite important. Really central to collective impact is placing a focus on equity and including community members in the collaborative. So really centering equity. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the rest of the webinar. Recruiting and co-creating cross-sectoral partners. So those cross-sectoral folks, maybe not the usual suspects. That's really what's involved with collective impact. Using data to continuously learn, adapt, and improve is also really important, and there's a lot of support there for that. But they're focused on cultivating a different kind of leader, a leader with unique systems leadership skills, and developing that kind of leadership is really important as well, and we'll do some more work with that. Focusing on, of course, program and system strategies, but really building a culture that fosters relationship, trust, and respect across participants. One other thing, we'll customize it for local context. Finally, human-centered design is another approach that we're really starting to work with now. As Gavin McCluskey says from the Tamarack Institute, it's really challenging to know the difference between what we know and what we think we know about communities, especially our assumptions around what we know about someone's lived experience. Human-centered design takes the position that we don't know what we think we know, but that there are tools we can employ to resolve this tension. Human-centered design did originate in the field of design and architecture. It is defined as the process of creating products that provide meaningful and relevant experiences to users. This involves the design of the entire process of acquiring and integrating the product, including aspects of branding, design, usability, and function. So really, user design is about understanding the user experience at every aspect of accessing a product. But for our purposes, the product is service provision and our resources across the social welfare systems, public and nonprofit. So our approach should be to involve content experts, often referred to as folks with lived experience, and it will bring about dramatic changes. So really getting at the user and what they need rather than forcing the user to fit the program or the system. We have a range of approaches and fundamental concepts that we want to work with, but we know there's no quick fixes. So no one of these will work. It's an iterative process that relies on combining and pieces from everything and really relying on our creativity and thinking through processes. But there are three important points that we need to be aware of. We need to lead with lived experience and build systems from the individual out. We need to work across systems to initiate systems change and bring that change to scale. But also that it's really possible to embrace complexity in structured ways and to tap into creative solutions that achieve and scale positive impacts. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the domains of change. So attempting to foster systems change without building the capacity to see systems leads to a lot of talk and very little results. So again, we're talking about that water. Talk more about how we can better see the water in the next section. The next part of the next part of the Weber is getting at seeing the water, making visible what is invisible or overlooked in our work. So we've decided to use 4 domains as a way to help us think about some of these broader conditions that are keeping homelessness in place. There's 4 of them that we're using: structural and systemic factors, equity and power dynamics, relationships and connections, mental models, and social narratives. We're using these domains in this exercise as conceptual spaces to help us identify where change is occurring across all these complex factors. However, they're not always distinct. We know that. They are interrelated, and they reveal both visible and hidden tensions that impact our ability to shift conditions. So we came up with our four conditions, our 4 domains, by adapting the 6 conditions of systems change by FSG. They identified a framework of 6 conditions that hold the complex social problems in place, and they range from explicit to semi-implicit and implicit. Much of the systems change management work in this module and future modules will tend to be more focused on the bottom 3 around the change management. However, all conditions are there and more are interrelated. So just step through, Amanda and I will step through the 4 domains and give you just a bit of a feel for what we're talking about and some examples. So the first one in domain 1 is the big broad ones. It's all the external conditions that impact the sector. Structural systemic factors that impact homelessness. They include global factors like poverty, colonization, increased migration, lack of affordable housing, discrimination, emerging environmental degradation, which is the big one, that further strain our social welfare net. We're going to introduce some of the tools and approaches being developed within the SPC toolbox designed to address the change at this macro level. We also know, though, that many of the interventions that we want to use lie largely outside of the homelessness sector itself, and society at large have yet to develop coherent responses. But we have to be aware how they impact us and factor them into all of our current work, particularly with systems planning. So so we'll talk a bit about systems mapping, systems intelligence tools, and human rights as change management tools that support the shift to upstream approaches, but that also require support to integrate them across our systems.
Yeah, so basically, what's really exciting about some of these systems mapping and systems intelligence tools that are emerging and being developed by Turner Strategies and pushed out through the SPC is that they're really evidence-led, and if properly integrated as a part of systems planning processes, can really be effective in driving some of these like shifts in thinking and approaches that we've been talking about. They can be change management tools in themselves. And this is partly because of it increasing our ability to map out the trends and communities' full spectrum of services and supports that can assist with resource management, making sure that we have the supports that people need when and where they need them. We'll be exploring Help Seeker in more depth, and there are other platforms and content on Help Seeker itself that you can dig into. But for now, what's really important here is that Help Seeker also has this incredible predictive capacity that's exciting from both a policy and a funding perspective. If we know what people need, the services that they're using, and what is available in our communities, and if we're able to track that supply and demand better, we can better resource the interventions and programs that we know will have an impact and achieve the outcomes that we hope to see. We can also plan better and respond better to things like natural disasters, migration, and other dramatic events that can affect supply and demand and that are real challenges for communities to respond to like in real time. And also, when we're grounding our work within human rights, it gives us a framework and language to speak to government decision makers and the policy and public about the changes that we're trying to make. It frees us from the confines of discourse and speaking about like limited resources and time, and actually getting us to explore these questions, these really important questions and meaningful questions of what would it look like if our communities were to provide a system of care that responds to the social and economic needs of individuals and families. That opens the door to testing and implementing approaches that will fundamentally change our systems rather than tacking on programs in a piecemeal kind of way. For example, Away Home and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness have been exploring duty to assist as a preventative policy initiative for addressing youth homelessness in municipalities. This is a model that comes out of Wales and requires caring adults to have a duty to take reasonable steps to assist a young person to find the supports they need when they are identified as being at risk of or currently experiencing homelessness. If we're able to test methods like these and approaches like these at the local level, we can start to build the case for larger scale change, and whether that be change across provinces, territories, or nationally, wherever is appropriate.
These tools and approaches support communities to manage change, but they also require change management to support them to integrate. So the SPC will provide support for integrations of systems intelligence tools like Help Seeker and the grounding of our work in human rights framework. There are existing resources that communities can access right now, as Amanda has mentioned, the duty to assist, and there will be more to come.
So with the structural and systemic domain of change in mind, here are some reflective questions for you, your organizations, and communities to consider at this point. First question is, what would it look like if our communities were to provide a system of care that responds to the unique social and economic needs of individuals and families? Second question builds on this. What's happening at the structural and systemic level in your province, territory, community, or even your organization that's encouraging and moving things in the right direction for being person-centered and rights-driven? And finally, what else needs to happen or be overcome in order to achieve this change?
So let's talk a bit about domain 2, which is equity and power dynamics. Plugging the voice of the community into the right kind of political power grid will do more to create health and wellness than any other single intervention. In domain 2, equity and power dynamics, we begin to consider how unequal proximity to power and privilege further challenge our ability to transform the way we provide homelessness services across systems. It involves trust or lack of between sectors, systems, communities, and governments. Planning initiatives need to center equity in our work so we don't reinforce inequitable systems and outcomes in their solutions. Our questions going forward are, how can we strive to better keep equity at the center of our work? How does infusing equity practices within our work change our processes and outcomes? Some examples or case studies to illustrate power dynamics are identified here. There are others, but they underpin all the work we do. So for example, underserved communities and the homelessness serving sector. There's a power differential there, or power dynamics, unequal one there. Also between the homelessness serving system itself and the public systems and the funders. Between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and governments. And then between all of us and priority populations, identified by class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, citizenship status. So many of these power dynamics underpin the work that we're doing and can undermine it as well. So we need to work to really center that and be aware of what's happening and actively work to rectify. They're not always clear, and they can also impact, create barriers, for example, to broad stakeholder engagement. Sometimes when you have potential lack of community buy-in early on in a process and you wonder why, sometimes it's the power dynamics that underpin this. And often when you have some early wins and some planning wins, but there's a decrease in momentum, that you need to maybe look at some of the power dynamics to see if that's undermining the process and what needs to be shored up, strengthened, who needs to be reached out to.
So here are some tools and approaches that we can embed into our collaborative practice that we'll share with you. So the first, we have this quote from Brian Stevenson about getting closer to the community and proximity. So if you're willing to get closer to people who are suffering, you will find the power to change the world. This means way more than consultation. Communities that are seeing change and transformation in their systems are not only informed by lived and living experience, but identify ways that they can embed opportunities for including and empowering lived experience through their systems planning processes as decision makers themselves. So to draw from the awesome folks at True Colors in the United States, this means that we have to shift our approach from merely receiving lived and lived experience advice to supporting lived and living experience to lead change and take action. We need to view lived and living experience as an asset in our communities and value it as such, paying for people's time, sharing feedback, creating dedicated space for those voices and for their leadership. And because this is ultimately because they provide the essential context expertise that grounds and informs how these systems need to change and improve, and ultimately to improve outcomes. One approach we can use is human-centered design and the tools that it provides for engaging with stakeholders that are both affected by issues and the solutions that we're proposing. This essentially means that we need to be more intentional about how and when we engage multiple players throughout systems planning and change work. Not everybody is going to be needed to be engaged in everything at the same time. And we need to be able to identify who needs to be at the table for those different decisions and for different moments within your systems planning process. And we'll explore more of this in our stakeholder engagement module, and as well as explore more of the human-centered design approaches and tools in more depth in the future. But it's worth drawing our attention to and so start to consider these things as you're beginning your systems planning work in your community.
So taking it further, we need to transform our systems to guarantee people with lived experience a meaningful seat at the table in every community, and ensure that our policy planning and practice places the user at the center. Our Module 1 guide contains approaches to equity change management that will be addressed in future modules and additional resources. So with lots of links, so we encourage you to check that, to visit that guide.
So now, thinking about the equity and power dynamics, reflect on the following questions either individually or as a group. How has your organization or community involved, engaged, or empowered lived and living experience? Are lived and living experience voices driving the conversation and action, or are they just being consulted? And if so, why is that, or how could that be changed or improved? And finally, what more could be done by your organization or community to elevate the role and the voices of people with lived and living experience of homelessness?
So domain 3 will perhaps have the biggest impact at the level of deliberated collaborations in systems planning. So that's at your planning tables, working with different levels of government and engaging unlikely stakeholder groups. Becoming system aware, or seeing the water, means the work of understanding the relationships and power dynamics between the system players. But just knowing and understanding without really addressing the human connection misses that vital element in our work. Our systems are made up of people. And transforming systems is really about transforming the relationships between people who make up the systems by focusing on the quality of connections and communication occurring across actors. So especially those with differing histories and viewpoints. This is definitely common sense, but it's not always common practice.
So we have this quote from Tulane Montgomery from an organization in the United States called New Profit Org that says, what does it mean to shift a system to have better outcomes for distinct populations that historically have been underserved by systems that are actually operating as they were designed to? We want to make sure that the systems we have are actually meeting the needs of those that they are intended to serve. But at the same time, the fact that systems do not always put the needs of individuals first or at the center is in part by design, and that design does benefit people. For example, jobs in human services are sometimes there because they fill the gaps that systems have, and the prospect of closing those gaps could have implications for those human services jobs. And there's fear and resistance sometimes to engaging with the opposing forces that want to preserve the status quo and maintain the systems that we have. And that might be because those systems and have greater power and influence than we do. Or sometimes it's just that we're uncomfortable to advocate for this systems change, for this transformation of a community to possibly make the community look different, even though it's we know that the way that systems operate now may not be leading to the best outcomes for people that are on the receiving end of services and supports. So change management to address these tensions requires that we create and hold enough of the right kinds of spaces to include discussions with those opposing forces, those folks that are really invested in the status quo. We can't shy away from these messy, intense, and often fraught conversations. And part of working on relationships and building trust is confronting the fears and apprehensions that come up with proposed change. And it's important to address those right from the beginning. If we let them go on or try to push them down, at some point it's going to bubble up to the surface and hinder your ability to make transformational change. So we need to give time to working through those fears, to helping people see how they are a part of that future state for your community that's preventing and ending homelessness, and that it's better for all of us, even if it might look different from what we're used to. So we'll explore more on the topic of change management in the future modules, and especially tools on how to manage that change, and also drawing upon real world examples from communities that have had to navigate and weather difficult transitions and conversations. The SPC will be offering additional supports to help bring together diverse stakeholder groups that may have never worked before. We're also going to be adapting tools and approaches such as collective impact, human-centered design, and other methodologies that can build those cross-sector coalitions, engage affected communities in shaping the solutions to homelessness, and bringing an equity lens to the work. Finally, we're going to be implementing systems intelligence tools that can begin to address both the relationships and power dynamics in systems planning efforts, tools such as Help Seeker. And again, you can refer to the Module 1 guide for more content. So now, with the relationships and connections domain of change in mind, consider the following questions. What are some of the apprehensions, tensions, fears, or concerns that you, your organization, or your community might have about changes involved in systems planning work? What are the relational factors that may have gotten in the way of transformational change in your community, either in the past or maybe at present? And finally, how will you meet people where they're at and hold safe and respectful space to have those difficult conversations?
So the fourth and final domain is the domain of mental models. Here's where we address deeply held beliefs and perhaps the clearest water we're swimming in, to take our metaphor further. So mental models are habits of thought, deeply held beliefs, or assumptions about the ways of operating that influence how we think, what we do, and how we talk. Fortunately, though, social narratives are actually the way we see the water, because they are the visible embodiments of the mental models. By changing social narratives, we can shift mental models over time. We must change the narratives that sustain problems. Narratives that fail to acknowledge or accurately portray the reality of inequality only serve to perpetuate it. So we really need to change those narratives that sustain problems. Start telling new stories that challenge the old narratives and therefore change the mental models. So we've listed a few examples here of social narratives that require challenging and various stages and that are attached to mental models. So one of them that's sort of, I think, folks are really familiar with is the Me Too movement, which really fundamentally changed changed our awareness of what constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace. It created a broader continuum of activities and includes policy and it really, before Me Too and after Me Too, there's been quite a shift in our attitude towards victims, survivors, and what constitutes sexual harassment. Another example is criminalizing drug addiction versus understanding it as a public health issue. So this is a very negative social narrative that continues to plague drug addiction. It's particularly with the issue of the opiate addiction or the opiate epidemic that's happening currently across Canada and North America. So really we need to shift the criminalizing aspects of drug addiction, that it's their fault, that they're somehow to blame for this condition, and understanding it as a public health issue, and that it's external conditions that created these problems in the first place, and that it can be addressed as a public health issue. So that is one that is in play right now as well, that it's quite critical to changing that narrative to public health from criminalizing. The one that I guess is most appropriate or most connected to our work is this age-old attitude that losing one's home or becoming homeless is due to who you are and the choices you make and your fault, rather than again the external conditions, the policies, all of the conditions that we talked about in the first three domains. So we really need to challenge that blaming the victim or blaming folks who experience homelessness for their situation by creating new stories, new narratives about what's really happening at that level. And finally, one that's just starting to emerge now is a definition of homelessness, that our current definition of homelessness really does focus on a built structure. Yet there's an emerging Indigenous definition of homelessness that focuses on the loss of relations as a result of colonization. And there's much work to be done for the Indigenous definition to challenge our current definition and help change the narratives there. So bringing our webinar to a close, I want to let us think about the power of stories and how we can use them. Thomas King's Massey Lectures in 2003, The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative, he says, "You have to be careful about the stories you tell, and you have to watch out for the stories you are told. But if we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives." So I'll just end with some reflective questions on the mental models domain, and I'll run through these with you. So what are some of the mental models that exist in your organization, community, or sector that create barriers to progressive policy in equity, diversion, or inclusion, for example? What are some mental models that currently exist in your own organization, community, or sector that support progressive policy? What are the social narratives or stories that are told to support regressive mental models? And what are some counter narratives and stories that could be created? You could begin discussing these in your teams, in your communities, at your planning tables, or even just reflecting on them as you do your work. So this brings us to the end of our Module 1 webinar for the SPC curriculum. If you have any questions or comments, please visit the discussion board on the Homelessness Learning Hub and put them there. Thank you so much for your time and joy.